2 in the morning somewhere in Indian Territory, the summer of 1873, and the herd is moving. Not because anyone gave an order. 2,000 longhorns are drifting east in the dark, quiet at first, then faster, hooves building from a shuffle into something that sounds like low thunder rolling up from the ground. You are riding night watch, and your horse has been working since sundown. You have slept maybe 3 hours in the last 2 days. Your mouth tastes like trail dust and bad coffee, and right now none of that matters, because if this herd runs, you are not going home with a paycheck. You might not be going home at all. This is where the real story of the American cowboy begins. Not in a clean saloon with a polished revolver and a brim turned just right. Not riding toward a horizon that looks like a painting. It begins here, in the dark. Watching livestock that can kill you by accident. Working a job that paid around $25 to $40 a month in the 1870s and 80s, and asked nothing from you except everything you had. Hollywood spent 100 years building a version of the cowboy that almost everyone in the world recognizes, and almost all of it is wrong. The movie Cowboy is a free man. He rides where he wants, answers to no one, handles trouble with a gun and a quiet word, and ends every story better than he started it. The real cowboy was a seasonal wage laborer. He was hired to do a specific job for a specific amount of money, and when the job was finished, he was let go. He worked inside a system built around cattle prices, railroad schedules, trail contracts, ranch investment, and market demand. He did not build that system. He did not control it. And most of the time, it did not reward him much for surviving it. That is not a sad ending. It is just the accurate one. And once you understand what the system actually was, the men who worked inside it make a lot more sense than the movie version ever did. The cattle business in the years following the Civil War was one of the largest moving enterprises in North American history. Texas ranchers had cattle. Northern cities had a demand for beef that was growing every year. Between those two facts sat several hundred miles of open prairie. No refrigeration, no paved roads, no reliable infrastructure, and a set of problems that needed solving every day to keep the whole operation from collapsing. The answer was the cattle drive. From roughly 1867 through the late 1880s, millions of longhorn cattle moved north out of Texas along a series of trail routes toward railroad shipping points in Kansas and Missouri. The Chisholm Trail carried more cattle than any other route, running from South Texas up through Indian Territory to the railheads at Abilene, Ellsworth, and later Wichita and Dodge City. The Western Trail ran further west toward Dodge City and eventually continued north into Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana as ranchers pushed to stock the northern ranges. The Goodnight Loving Trail cut west into New Mexico and north into Colorado. And it carried its own particular dangers in dry country with very little reliable water. On any one of these drives, a herd of between 1,000 and 3,000 cattle moved an average of 10 to 15 miles a day, roughly 90 days from South Texas to the Kansas railheads, sometimes longer depending on weather, water, river conditions, and the condition of the herd. Each drive required a crew. The size of that crew depended on the size of the herd, but a rough standard was 1 cowboy for every 200 to 300 cattle. A drive of 2,000 cattle might carry 7 or 8 working cowboys, plus a trail boss, a cook, and a wrangler to manage the Remuda, which was the rotating group of spare horses each drive kept moving alongside the herd. This is where you start to see how the system actually worked. The trail boss was not a cowboy. He was a manager. He had usually made several drives before. He was selected by the ranch owner or the cattle investor, and he carried full authority over every decision from the starting point to the railhead. He decided when to move, when to stop, where to water, where to bed the herd, when to push through rough weather, and when to hold. He negotiated with landowners along the route, handled disputes with other trail crews, managed relations with native nations whose territory the trail crossed, and made judgment calls that could save or destroy the entire investment. A trail boss could earn $80 to $150 a month, sometimes more, where a working cowboy earned $25 to $40. Below the trail boss, the crew was organized by position, and position determined how hard your day was going to be. Point riders worked at the front of the herd on either side, guiding the lead cattle in the right direction. It was a skilled job. Lead cattle were usually experienced longhorns, animals that had been on previous drives or that carried natural authority in the herd. If the point riders could keep the lead animals calm and moving at the right pace, the rest of the herd followed. Point was still hard work, but you were breathing relatively clean air, and you had some actual control over what was happening in front of you. Swing riders and flank riders worked further back along the sides, keeping the herd from spreading too wide and turning back any animals that tried to drift from the main body. This required constant attention and constant movement. You were not riding in a straight line. You were riding sideways, circling back, cutting off individual cattle, working your horse in ways that burned through energy faster than a simple forward march. Drag riders worked at the back. If you were new, if you were the youngest, if you were the least experienced or the lowest in the informal pecking order of the crew, you were riding drag. You were behind the entire herd, eating the dust of every animal in front of you, pushing along the cattle that were sick or lame or just too tired to keep pace with the main body. On a dry day in Texas or Indian Territory in July, drag riders wore bandanas or rags over their faces and still spent the entire day breathing enough fine dust to make your lungs feel like sandpaper by sunset. One historical account describes a young drover arriving at camp after a full day on drag, so coated in dust and dried sweat that his own crewmates barely recognized him. That is not an exaggeration. That is just what drag looked like. The Remuda was managed by the wrangler, who was often one of the youngest and lowest paid members of the crew. Each cowboy on a cattle drive did not ride one horse. He rode several. The standard for long drives was roughly 6 to 10 horses per rider kept in rotation, and they were cycled throughout the day and across the week so that no single horse was worked to exhaustion. Horses were the one resource the drive could not replace cheaply or quickly. A broken-down horse in the middle of Indian Territory was a serious problem. The Remuda was not a luxury. It was a supply chain. And the wrangler who managed it had to keep those animals fed, watered, rested, and available on short notice for whatever the trail boss needed next. The cook ran the chuckwagon, and anyone who has read accounts from actual trail drivers will tell you that the cook was one of the most important people on the drive. His authority over the camp area was absolute by custom. You did not ride your horse through the cook's workspace. You did not complain about the food loudly enough for him to hear. You did not help yourself to anything before he said it was ready. None of these were written rules. They were just understood. The food itself was not good. It was functional. Beans, dried beef, salt pork, cornbread, sourdough biscuits, and coffee that was black and strong and often kept going for hours on the same grounds. Tea, occasionally dried fruit if the supply held. Fresh meat when an animal died on the trail or when the cook could butcher one that was not going to survive the march anyway. There was no refrigeration. The cook worked with what he had, made it stretch, and kept the crew fed enough to work. A sick or starving crew meant a failing drive, so the chuckwagon was not a comfort. It was infrastructure. Sleep was the other thing that separated real cowboy life from everything you see on a movie screen. Night watch was not optional. Every night, the herd had to be watched by rotating riders who circled the bedded cattle and watched for anything that might spook them. A sleeping herd was still a dangerous herd. Cattle could be startled into a stampede by a sudden noise, a lightning flash, a smell on the wind, a coyote passing too close, or sometimes no visible reason at all. Night watch shifts typically ran 2 hours at a stretch, but the rotation depended on the size of the crew and how many nights of poor sleep had already stacked up. On a drive with a small crew or through a stretch of rough weather, you might be riding night watch on 4 hours of sleep that followed another night of 4 hours that followed another night of 4 hours before that. Cumulative sleep deprivation is not a minor inconvenience. It affects judgment, reaction time, and balance. It makes a horse feel wrong under you in ways that are hard to describe. It makes the moment when a herd starts drifting in the dark feel slower and more confused than it needs to be. Cowboys sang on night watch. That is not a romantic detail. It had a practical purpose. The cattle were used to the presence of human voices, and a steady, quiet sound from the rider circling them was a signal that nothing was wrong. Silence from the night herder was more alarming to bedded cattle than sound. Most accounts agree that the actual songs did not matter much. What mattered was the rhythm and the continuity of the human voice in the dark. But here is the part most movies skip entirely. Stampedes happened anyway. No system prevented them completely. On a long drive, a stampede was not an unlikely catastrophe. It was a near certainty that the crew prepared for from the first night. When a herd ran, every rider had to move fast in the dark on tired horses over ground nobody had checked for holes or soft spots. The goal was to get ahead of the lead animals and turn the herd in a wide circle. No fine. What drovers called milling the herd, until the animals ran into each other's flanks and slowed from exhaustion and confusion. Riders were thrown. Horses went down. Cattle did not stop for a man on the ground in the dark. The records from the trail drive era include accounts of cowboys killed in stampedes, horses destroyed after falls, and cattle losses that could reduce a profitable drive to a break-even run or worse. The historical evidence does not give a clean total for how many men died on trail drives across the full era. The records are incomplete, and many deaths were never formally reported. But the danger was real, and everyone on the trail knew it going in. River crossings were a different kind of danger, slower and more deliberate, but just as capable of going wrong in a hurry. Moving 2,000 longhorns across a wide river like the Red River, the Arkansas, or the Cimarron required planning and timing that no trail boss could rush through. Cattle are strong swimmers, but they panic under pressure, and a panicking herd in moving water could push animals downstream, exhaust horses trying to hold the herd together, and put riders into current they had not planned on swimming through. Trail bosses would stop and wait for high water to drop before attempting a major crossing. Sometimes that wait was a day. Sometimes it was a week. A week of waiting with 2,000 cattle eating the grass around the campsite was a problem in itself. Overgrazed ground near river crossings was a documented issue on the major trails by the heavy years of the early 1870s. And trail bosses had to decide whether to push across rough water or wait on ground that was already thin. And while the trail boss was making those calculations, the cattle were still eating, the horses were still eating, and the crew's wages were still running. Time was money in a way that was not abstract. Every extra day on the trail was a day of wages, a day of supplies, a day of weight loss from the cattle, and a potential delay at the railhead where prices could shift while you waited. The cattle market at the end of the trail was its own brutal system. When a drive arrived at a shipping point like Abilene or Dodge City, the trail boss negotiated with cattle buyers who represented meat processors and stockyard companies in Chicago, Kansas City, and points east. The buyers knew exactly what the current market was. The trail boss knew approximately what the market had been when he left Texas 3 months earlier. That information gap was real, and the buyers used it. He had 2,000 animals that needed to be sold. He could not take them back to Texas without repeating the entire drive in reverse. He needed a price, and the buyers knew it. The railroad set the schedule. The buyers set the price within that schedule. The trail boss sold at whatever the market would bear, which was often less than the ranch owners back in Texas had projected. The records from the major Kansas shipping points show cattle prices fluctuating sharply across the drive era, with the gap between Texas expectations and Kansas reality causing real financial damage to drives that had survived everything the trail could throw at them. And then there was what happened to the Cowboys' wages in town. The cow towns of Kansas were not incidental to the cattle economy. They were designed specifically to extract money from trail crews holding several months of accumulated pay. Saloons, gambling houses, hotels, bathhouses, laundries, clothing merchants, and other businesses positioned themselves at the railhead towns with one primary purpose. The trail crew arrived with cash. The town was built to move that cash elsewhere as quickly as possible. A cowboy who earned $30 a month over a 90-day drive arrived in Abilene or Dodge City holding roughly $90, sometimes more if the trail boss paid a completion bonus. After a bath, clean clothes, a few meals, a few nights of drinking, and a few hands of cards, it could be gone in 2 or 3 days. The historical accounts are consistent on this point. Many cowboys left cow towns with less than they arrived with, having run credit at saloons and gambling tables that ate into the next season's wages before the next season had even started. This is the real architecture of the cattle economy. The ranch owner funded the drive. The trail boss managed it. The cowboys worked it. The buyers purchased the herd at market. The railroad moved the cattle east. The cow town extracted what remained from the labor force. And at the end of all of that, the cowboy went back to looking for work. The wages were low by any reasonable comparison. $25 to $40 a month for genuinely dangerous, physically punishing outdoor labor performed in heat that could reach over 100 degrees on summer drives. Or in cold that dropped well below freezing on northern range work. No health care, no workers' compensation, no pension, no guaranteed employment next season. If you were injured on the trail, the drive moved on. If you were too sick to ride, the drive moved on. The operation had a destination and a deadline, and individual welfare was secondary to both. The Chuckwagon carried a basic medicine supply. Crews used what they had for cuts, minor infections, and sickness. Serious injuries were a different problem. The nearest doctor was wherever the nearest town was, which on long stretches of the Chisholm or Western Trail could be a considerable ride across empty country. Historical accounts mention fractures from falls, rope burns, infections from untreated wounds, heat exhaustion, and occasional snake bites. Most of these were managed with whatever the crew had on hand. A man who could not work was not useful to a drive that had a deadline, and the drive would not wait. Now here is a piece of the real history that the movie version almost never shows. The actual trail driving workforce was not the all-white cast you see in most westerns. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the cowboys who worked the cattle drives were black men or men of Mexican and Tejano descent. The exact percentage is debated because the records are incomplete, but the overall picture is consistent across the serious historical literature. After the Civil War, freedmen in Texas entered the cattle labor market in large numbers. Many had worked with cattle before as enslaved people on Texas ranches, and that experience made them valuable to trail bosses who needed competent riders and cattle handlers. Figures like Bose Ickard, who worked for Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving on the trail that carries their names, are documented in historical records and in Goodnight's own later accounts as skilled, trusted, and essential. Nat Love published a memoir in 1876 describing a career as a black cowboy in the western cattle industry. Historians treat some of the more dramatic claims with caution, but the book reflects a real experience that the popular history largely ignored for most of the 20th century. Black cowboys worked the same trails, did the same jobs, ate from the same chuckwagon, and took the same risks as white cowboys. The system around them still reflected the racial politics of post-Civil War Texas and the broader frontier West. Wages and treatment were not always equal. Opportunities for advancement to trail boss or foreman were more limited. But the labor economy that built the cattle industry depended heavily on a workforce that no major Western film from Hollywood's peak years was willing to show honestly. Mexican and Tejano vaqueros were not just participants in the cattle industry. They were its foundation. The entire technical vocabulary of the American cattle trade came from the Mexican ranching tradition. The saddle design, the lasso, the reata, the techniques for handling cattle on horseback, the practice of driving large herds over long distances. So all of it was developed in Mexican ranching culture over two centuries before Anglo-Texans launched the trail drive era. Vaqueros worked on Texas ranches and on cattle drives throughout the period, and the evidence in gear, vocabulary, and technique is unmistakable, even when the historical record is thin on individual names. The West was not a single demographic experience. Native nations crossed paths with cattle drives constantly, sometimes through negotiated toll arrangements and trade, sometimes in conflict. Black soldiers in the Buffalo Soldier regiments patrolled the same territories the drives moved through. Hispanic communities had roots in Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado that predated Anglo settlement by generations. It was a collision of peoples working under pressure in a landscape that rewarded practical skill and punished mistakes regardless of who you were. But the cowboy myth that came out of that era was built almost entirely around one kind of man and one kind of story, and it sold that version so hard and for so long, that most people are still surprised to learn the actual picture looked different. Now here is where the system that created the cowboy finally broke down. The cattle drive era was not a permanent feature of the American landscape. It lasted roughly 20 years in its classic form, from the late 1860s to the late 1880s, and it ended because the systems that created it were replaced by newer, more efficient ones. Barbed wire was patented in 1874 and was in wide commercial production by the late 1870s. Within a decade, it had transformed the open range into a landscape of fenced private property. The Chisholm Trail did not disappear in a single dramatic moment. It was fenced shut, piece by piece, as landowners in Kansas, Indian Territory, and Texas drew boundaries the old trail routes could not legally cross. By the middle of the 1880s, major stretches were blocked by wire, and the trail boss who had managed open-range drives for a decade suddenly had to negotiate crossings or abandon the drive model altogether. Refrigerated railroad cars changed the equation at the other end. For most of the drive era, cattle had to be shipped live because there was no reliable way to keep butchered meat from spoiling in transit. As refrigeration technology improved through the 1870s and 80s, it became practical to butcher cattle closer to where they were raised and ship processed beef east. The centralization of meat processing in Chicago and Kansas City, driven by companies like Swift and Armour, meant the live cattle drive to a Kansas railhead was no longer the best model. Ranching moved toward a year-round, fenced, locally supplied operation, and the trail drive gradually became a relic of an earlier moment. The last significant drives on the Chisholm Trail happened in the mid to late 1880s. The Western Trail continued a few years longer, carrying cattle north into Wyoming and Montana. But by 1890, the open-range cattle drive as the dominant form of the American beef industry was effectively finished. This left the cowboys who had built their working lives around the drive model in a difficult position. Some transitioned to ranch work on the new fenced operations. Some moved further west. Some went north to Wyoming and Montana. Some left the cattle business entirely. For men who had spent their 20s and 30s doing drive work, the end of the drive era was the end of the only labor market they knew. The winter of 1886 and 1887 is worth stopping on for a moment. That winter was one of the most destructive in recorded memory across the northern Great Plains. Temperatures dropped to levels that killed cattle by the tens of thousands across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. Ranchers who had overstocked their ranges during the profitable years of the early 1880s watched their herds die in the snow. Some operations lost more than half their cattle. Some lost nearly everything. Investors in the eastern states and in Britain who had funded northern cattle ventures saw their projections destroyed in a single season. The myth of the open range was not killed by barbed wire or refrigeration alone. It was killed by the reality that the land had limits. The weather had its own plans, and systems built on assumptions of endless growth were fragile in ways that only became visible when conditions turned bad. The cattle boom of the 1870s and 80s was in part a financial speculation. Funded by Eastern and British investors who read promotional pamphlets about the open range the same way a later generation would read real estate brochures. Ranchers made projections about annual returns that depended on ideal conditions continuing indefinitely. The winter of 1886 demonstrated that ideal conditions did not continue forever, and the collapse that followed accelerated the end of the open-range system faster than barbed wire or refrigeration alone could have managed. The cowboy did not cause that collapse. He was a worker inside it. But he felt the consequences directly when ranches closed, crews were cut, and the seasonal labor market that had employed him through his best working years shrank down to something much smaller. This is the thread that runs through all of it. The real cowboy worked inside systems he did not build and could not fully control. He could be excellent at his job, a skilled rider, a reliable night herder, someone who knew cattle behavior well enough to read a herd before it ran. None of that guaranteed him financial security or career longevity. The trail boss above him answered to the ranch owner. The ranch owner answered to the cattle market. The cattle market answered to railroad prices, butcher demand, weather, Eastern finance, and a dozen other factors that had nothing to do with skill on horseback. The cowboy at the bottom of that chain was doing the most dangerous physical work, sleeping the least, eating the worst food, breathing the most dust, and taking home the smallest share of what the whole enterprise produced when it worked. When the enterprise stopped working, he was the first one cut loose. Think of any complex modern supply chain. The worker who moves the freight does not set the shipping rates. The person at the bottom of an interdependent commercial system rarely designed it, controls it, or profits most from it when it runs well. The cattle drive economy was not so different, except that it was conducted on horseback across open prairie with no safety net and no labor protections of any kind. That is not a story Hollywood built its product around. The movie version needed a hero who was free, who was independent, who made his own fate with a gun and a good horse. The real version needed a laborer who was practical, tough, adaptable, and ultimately replaceable, working a system that needed him exactly as long as the trail was open, and not one season longer. The interesting thing is that the real version is actually harder and more remarkable than the movie version ever managed to be. Anyone can write a character who rides alone and wins every fight. It takes something genuinely impressive to follow a man through 90 days of drag, night watch, bad river crossings, stampedes in the dark, 100 degrees of dust and heat, food that was keeping him alive rather than satisfying him, 3 hours of sleep before another full day, and still arrive at the railhead in Kansas with the herd intact and the work done. That is not a fantasy. That is a work record. Back to 2 in the morning in Indian Territory. The herd has settled. It took about 40 minutes of riding and careful work in the dark. 2 men on each flank pushing the drifting cattle back toward the bedded group, while another rider moved ahead and turned the lead animals before they could pull the whole herd after them. Nobody drew a gun. Nobody made a speech. The horses were worked well, and the cattle found the calm they were looking for. By the time the eastern sky begins to gray, the trail boss is already up. The cook has coffee on the fire, and the day's march is being laid out for the next 10 to 15 miles. The cowboy riding in from the last night watch gets half an hour to eat before the herd starts moving again. He is maybe 22 years old, or maybe 35. He is perhaps from East Texas, or from Georgia after the war, or from a vaquero family that has been working cattle since before his grandfather was born. His name is not in any record that survived. He has no famous gun or famous story. He has a month of wages coming, a horse that needs rest, and roughly 60 more days on this trail before he sees a town. He does the job because it is the job he knows, and because somewhere at the end of the trail there is a paycheck, and because in 1873 there were not many options for a man who had grown up working cattle and had no other trade. That is what the American cowboy actually was. Not a myth, not a symbol, not a movie. A worker in a dangerous economy, doing real labor for real wages in a system that needed him exactly as long as the trail was open, and not one day longer.